Welcome to A Pastor's Heart. My name is Pastor Patrick, and I'm so glad that you clicked on this video. If you're new to the channel, welcome. If you're returning, welcome back. So this video today, this topic is going to be just a little bit different from a lot of the other videos that have been presented on this channel. I've talked a lot throughout the course of over the last year about fundamentals of relationship with Jesus and what it meant to be a Christian, things like identity and personality and, living the will of God and, just the fundamentals of relationship. But I've had a lot of people come to me and ask me questions about the Bible, about, the Christian faith and, kind of an overview. And so what I wanted to do in this video is I wanted to present the Bible in a way that maybe you've never thought of or never heard it presented. But I find that a lot of people who read the Bible start looking at things like, well, the Old Testament, that was what was considered the Old Covenant. That's history. We don't, there's some interesting stories that we may pull from it, whether it's the story of Daniel or, if you've ever heard the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Maybe, even in children's ministry, you hear, some churches presenting, stories of, not only Israel and Egypt, but, the 12 plagues, or maybe the story of Noah. You might have heard stories from the Old Testament. But most people just, kind of take the Old Testament and say, it's kind of irrelevant for how we live today. And the reality is, when you look at the Bible overall, the full Bible, from Genesis all the way to Revelation, you start to see something very interesting. And what that is what I call the mirror of the Bible. Now, if you know what a mirror is, it's a piece of glass with a coating on the back of it, which provides a reflection. And so if you've ever looked in a mirror, whether you're, in the morning brushing your hair, brushing your teeth, or getting ready to leave or, whatnot, getting out of the shower. When you look at a mirror, you see exactly what you're looking at. However, you see it in reverse. So, for instance, if you're to take your hands and raise them up in the mirror, you could do like, an L, which would be for your left hand. But when you look in the mirror, it will be backwards. It will be facing the other direction. It will not be an L, because the mirror shows you what you're looking at, but shows it reversed from left to right. And understanding that example of what a mirror is how we understand the Bible is to be presented. The Bible can be understood. And what that is that in a general overview of the Bible, we look at the fact that the Bible can be broken up into 11 different segments that mirror image each other from the Old Testament to the New Testament. I'll say this quickly and then we'll go through each one as I talk about how they're all broken down. The first thing we understand in the Bible is that in the beginning, God created man, created heaven and earth, and righteous people had a relationship with God. Because when God created Adam and Eve, he created them without sin. He created them perfect, and they were in righteous or right standing with God. So that's the story we understand in the beginning. But very quickly, soon thereafter, Satan entered, deceived Adam and Eve, and sin entered the world at that point. So immediately thereafter, in the very first book of the Bible, we have the beginning of creation, the beginning of relationship with God, and then the severing of the relationship with God immediately. Next, we fast forward in time to a one world government, if you will. And that, the idea was that first the world would be judged because God became frustrated with the activities of people. And this is what led to the flood, Noah and the flood. And so that flood was technically the first time where God had to react to the way the world was behaving, that sin had become so terrible. After that is when the one world government actually stepped in, because that's when we understand the Tower of Babel. Fast forward to God breaking that Tower of Babel and the people, and that's when he separated people into different tribes, different nations, and that's where we come up with nations around the world. There are some people that argue that if you look from a scientific standpoint, that you can look at the continents of the world and you can see how they could all fit together as one landmass. And so there is a theory in some religious beliefs that when God destroyed the Tower of Babel and broke everybody up is when the continents were moving and separating into what we know today, covered with the ocean, covered with the water, and why we have different dialects, different ethnicities, so on and so forth. After the Old Covenant and the Old Testament, and all the prophecies leading towards God correcting this sin and this mistake, is the entrance of Jesus Christ. Everything in the Bible points to Jesus Christ. If you looked at the thumbnail on this video, you'll see this analogy outlined, and there will be a link for you to be able to download a copy of it in the description of this video, so that you can keep this as something to follow along with notes. Let me quickly add, if these videos are really helpful and really understanding, I would appreciate you to like and subscribe, maybe share the video, share the content with others that you may think would enjoy it and would learn from it. There will be a buy me a coffee link, in the description if you'd like to help support the channel as well. So after the Old Testament points to Jesus, we then start seeing the reflection or the opposition of the way things happened in the beginning. And that is, we immediately go to a new covenant. That's where Jesus establishes the church and establishes new relationship with how we are to interact with him. And I'll dive into that a little deeper in a minute. Next, completely opposition, we fast forward to Revelation, and we look at the fact that we go right back to a one world government. Now, that phrase is not used in the Bible, but the example is obviously the Antichrist, the entering of the last days, the tribulation, where, the mark of the beast and all that, and I'll get into it. After that, the world is judged and destroyed, and that is in the book of Revelation with the second coming of Jesus, not only the rapture, but the reconciliation where everybody will be judged. The mirror of that. And then, just like in the beginning where the mirror was Satan and sin entered the world, this is when, during the judgment, Satan and the demons are cast into hell. So therefore, Satan and sin exit. The complete opposite of the beginning. And then at the very end, we have the mirror image of how everything was created in the beginning, which is God and redeemed man. We were not righteous anymore because of sin, but God redeems us through the blood. After the judgment, we are redeemed, and then God and redeemed people come together again in paradise. And so therefore we end the whole situation, the whole story, going back to the way things were supposed to be in the first place. And so if we look at, this mirror image, I'll go back to the beginning as we walk through it. You look in the book of Genesis, in chapter 1, it lists literally, verse by verse. It talks about, in the beginning, God created the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness covered the deep. And then God, using his words, spoke, let there be light, let there be land, let there be water. And this is verse by verse description. Now, there are some theological personnel that look at the first two verses of the Bible, and they say that there's a possibility that maybe God had to do some intervention in the creation of the world. Because Genesis 1 verse 1 says, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. One verse, that's all it says. But then verse 2 says, that's when it says, the earth was without form and void, and it starts describing how he did it. So there's some that say, well, verse 1 is what he did. Verse 2 through the rest of the chapter describes how he did it, portion by portion. Other people say, well, maybe God created everything, and then when he cast Satan or Lucifer out of heaven, he had to recreate things and clean some stuff up. And that's where we have the description of what he did to make things correct. Because the thing you have to understand is spirits and humans exist at the same time, but not in the same space. That's why we don't see angels, we don't see demons. We think we see ghosts, but the supernatural realm is unseen to the naked eye. And so it is possible that God cast Satan or Lucifer out of heaven before there was anywhere on earth, that he just cast him out into space, and then he created the earth. So there's just some speculation of that. But as it goes, in the beginning, we've read the story of how God created the heaven and the earth. And then in chapter 2, how God then creates Adam and Eve. And, whether you get into the demographics of, the rib and, woman being equal to man and, the depth of what that is, but also God creating Eden, the paradise that they would have relationship and communion in, and they, and you had the tree of life, and you had, all the animals, and everything was coexisting and everything was fine before the entrance of sin. And so, that's where we can understand that, understanding an overview of the Bible is how you can approach the fact that ultimately you do need to read as much of the Old Testament as you do the New Testament. That just because you may say New Testament, New Covenant, we're doing things differently now, if you don't know the past, then you don't know how things are put together. If you look at it this way, think of it, whether it's a car engine, if you like toys, think of a Lego set. If somebody hands you a box of Legos and all the pieces are in a box for you to put together, you either have to get creative and figure out what you want to put together, or if you've got a diagram of what it looked like put together, you'll be able to, what's called reverse engineer, you'll be able to figure out what parts go, what pieces go together to put it back the way it was. And so if you don't read the Old Testament, if you don't understand the history of the world, the history of sin, the history of the Old Testament and the Old Covenant, you can't understand how that applies to the New Testament, how that applies to the way we live today. I find that a lot of churches and a lot of pastors are trying to make things more about, it's a gathering of, just getting together and, self-help and celebrityism and let's be happy and, and this and that, and not getting down to the nuts and bolts of what Christianity is and understanding the fundamentals of what's going on here. So as we look in Genesis 3, that's when you have Satan, the serpent, coming in, the temptation, Adam and Eve eating of the fruit, and that's when they hid from God, Adam and Eve, when he came asking for them. And ultimately, that's the entrance of disobedience. That's the entrance of sin. That's where we get the entrance and the beginning of the consequences of sin is death. Because if you read through in Genesis, you'll understand that not only did he cast them out of Eden, but it also talks about how long they lived, several hundred years. Because the thing is that what you have to understand is time is relative. In modern day, we equate time by seconds equals minutes equals hours equals a day equals a week, a month, and a year. We have put a stamp on equating and calculating time. But that doesn't mean that back in the Bible that they went by the time signature that we do now. They didn't necessarily equate 60 minutes equals an hour, or 24 hours equals a day, or 7 days is a week. So when the Bible says that Adam lived hundreds of years, sometimes in our modern day where, it's great for us to live to 100 or 115 or so, it's hard for us to comprehend several hundred years, or even living half a century, 500 years old. How could you live that long? And the thing is that when Adam and Eve sinned, that's when the consequences of sin, death, entered the world. The consequences of their actions entered. But that doesn't mean that the consequences of their actions were instant. And that's the thing that you have to understand. I've talked a little bit on this channel about the consequences of sin, because Jesus paid for the consequence of sin. Jesus paid death so that we could have everlasting life. But sin still has consequences while you live here on earth. And those consequences may not happen in a day, they may take years. But whatever sin you commit does have consequences, even if you're forgiven. That's the misunderstanding a lot of people in the church have when they talk about grace all the time. Because they think, oh, I've sinned, God forgives me, I said sorry, I meant it, I swear, and move on. Not realizing that a lot of the consequences you have in your life, a lot of the things that are bad, that go wrong, are consequences of the actions and the sins that you commit. Because even though God will forgive you the sin, that means ultimately at the end, in the judgment, you will not die and go to hell. That doesn't mean that you won't deal with consequences of sin right now. The Bible never says anywhere that not only does God forgive you of your sin, God erases the consequences. It says God forgets about them. God moves on from them. But it doesn't say that your consequences are erased. It says that the end judgment of what you're due has been paid. That's where we have to understand that. So as we look that Satan and sin entered the world, and it broke not only the covenant that God had created with Adam and Eve, it broke their whole complete lifestyle. They were no longer in the Garden of Eden where everything was taken care of for them. They were no longer able to eat the fruit of the tree of life and live forever. They were no longer in a garden that was self-sustaining. It goes further where it talks about Adam will need to till, and labor the land in order to provide for himself. It talked about Eve will need to now bear children in pain and suffering. These were the consequences of no longer living in Eden, living in paradise. These are consequences we still live with today. And so when you understand that, it wasn't just they no longer were living in Eden. It was a series of consequences that came down in every area of their life, how it affected everything. Because their sons, Cain and Abel, and how they had that fight, and how Cain killed Abel and committed the first murder. It's all of this entering in the world that was not designed to be that way. And this all points to the need for Jesus. If we go to part 3, we see that, we fast forward into Genesis chapter 6, and we see that the sin of the world has gotten so bad that God himself is like, I don't know Maybe I should just start over. And that's where Noah comes in, because Noah is a man of God. Noah and his family, technically, if you will, the first savior of the world, because that's the lineage that we all come from. And so when you look at that, that's where in Genesis 6, chapter 6 through 9, God judges the world for its widespread, wickedness and violence and sin. And he sends a flood to destroy the world. But before then, he gave the warning for Noah to build the ark. And we know that story, or should know that story, I would hope. And, that's where it comes into the play of understanding, the purpose of the judgment, understanding the purpose of, why God judged the world and destroyed it, and how he chose. And then it even talks about, in the flood of, that's where we get the rainbow, because God promised not to do that again. And that's why we know in Revelation, the end judgment will be with fire. And so that's where we understand how we've started this trek from the creation of the world, the entrance of sin, and then fast forwarding a couple of chapters where it talks about humanity just being so deviant. If we fast forward to part 4 in Genesis 10, that's where, some people have termed Genesis 10 and 11 to be the table of nations. And this is where we get the story of the Tower of Babel. And it's, as a Christian, I will just say it's so interesting and ironic that if you know about technology, that there is an app called Babel that literally fits the same narrative of the Bible. And that app that you can get on your phone or your computer is an app for you to learn how to speak in multiple languages. And it's just ironic that we still use the very same term from thousands of years ago in the Old Testament of what the Tower of Babel was, because since everybody lived together on one continent, everybody shared the same lifestyle, the same ideas, and the same dialect. Everybody spoke the same language. And in the Tower of Babel, where they decided that they were going to build a temple all the way to heaven. Now, we have skyscrapers now, and it's interesting that, continents throughout the world, different countries are trying to build the next tower, the next monument that's bigger than somebody else's, whether it's Dubai or, anywhere in Europe or, I don't know that anything generally is being built in North America right now that's trying to be bigger than anything else. But it's interesting how we have all these structures that, are into the sky, but just because we're building skyscrapers and large monuments now, it's not that it's not the same intent that it was the Tower of Babel. The Tower of Babel wasn't just to build the biggest, tallest monument they could. In the description in the Bible, it talked about not only the unity of all humanity, but it also talks about all the societies were coming together in unity so that they could reach heaven, so that they could be in charge of themselves, that they weren't going to be serving God, they were going to be God. And the thing you have to understand is the Bible never says anything about a one world government or anything else. But when you look at the implication, but it's kind of an idea of the Tower of Babel being a cautionary tale of human pride and trying to take God out of the equation. It's not just about building a monument or something like that, but when they talk about we want to build to heaven, we want to be our own leader, our own king. we want to be in charge of ourselves. And if you look at modern today, there's so many people in society. That's it. It's my body, my choice, or it's I don't believe in God. I don't believe in salvation. That whole Christianity religion thing is a gimmick. And I'm in charge of myself. I make my own decision. I am God. And it's just interesting that when you look throughout the Bible, the first time that God interacts with creation, where the sin has gotten too bad, is Noah and the flood. And the second time that God interacts with creation, with humanity, for the amount of sin and, defiance against God, is the Tower of Babel. And the third time will be in Revelation with the final judgment. So this is not new. And so when we understand how we've gotten to the points that we get to with regards to each step in the Bible, we can understand what happened to lead to Jesus. The next and most important is what we call the Abrahamic, depending on how you enunciate it, the covenant that God made with Abraham. I will make you a father of many nations, so on and so forth. Because the lineage of Noah had 3 sons, and that's where, the main thing started, but it was Abraham that literally fathered nations. And so that's where the people of God come from when God made a covenant with Abraham, the father of many nations. And that's in Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3, where, the Bible says, now the Lord said to Abram, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. And I'll make you a great nation, and I will bless you, make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. And that's the beginning of how we understand where God talked to Abram, and when he had his first son, had changed his name to Abraham and changed his wife's name from Sarai to Sarah, because names are very important. We don't talk about that in today's culture anymore. We don't talk about the fact that a name carries weight. It carries importance. When you name an animal or name a device, that name is part of its identity and part of its function. And so when you're given a name, such as mine being Patrick, Patrick has, not only an Irish heritage, but it has a biblical narrative too of what my name stands for. And so when God changed his name from Abraham to Abraham, being the father of many nations, it was a definition. Lucifer, in the Old Testament, Lucifer was the angel of light. That's what his name was. When he was cast out of heaven, he was given a new name, Satan. He was no longer an angel of light. He was now an angel of death. Totally changed his name, changed his definition, changed his purpose. And so the whole point of the Old Testament is for us to understand the different books throughout the Old Testament where God created that covenant with his people. That's where he created things like the 10 Commandments. That's where he created things where, the law and the prophets speaking about the coming of Jesus, the Savior of the world. See, the Old Testament prophecies, whether it was Isaiah, Ezekiel, etc., these prophecies weren't just prophesying about Jesus coming. They were prophesying about Jesus completely fixing everything. And that's why we understand in Revelation about the second coming of Jesus, where he will come again. Because the first thing he had to do was he had to save the world from sin. Then he will come back and he will redeem the world and fix it. See, the misconception, the misunderstanding that a lot of the prophets had, and certainly when we fast forward to the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and we start reading about the Pharisees and their misinterpretation of Jesus and being who he said he was, is the fact that everybody expected Jesus to come and not only redeem us, but to fix the world all at the same time. And the reason that did not happen, the reason Jesus had to come once to redeem and second to judge, had to separate those two, is because if he had come to judge the world at the same time, there would have been no way for him to redeem us. You know, if you ever think, if you've ever, especially in North America, if you've ever been, you know, um, accused of a crime, let's say a misdemeanor, let's say you were speeding and you need to go to a court before a judge to talk about, speeding and the incident or whatever happened, you know, you can't if you get a ticket, from an officer, at least in America, that ticket says, okay, you're going to have to go before a judge and talk about this crime before you pay for it. They don't just immediately take you to jail or, take your car away or anything like that. They immediately first say you need to understand your consequences, then you need to pay for them. And so the fact is that Jesus didn't come to the earth to be judge first. He came to be Savior so that he can pay for our consequences, then come back and judge. And that's the misconception that the Pharisees had, and many people in the prophecies of the Old Testament, because the prophecies in the Old Testament weren't just that Jesus was going to come, that our Savior was going to come and save the world, but that he was going to come and judge the world too. But it wasn't till many years later that we would understand those things to be two separate incidences, or two separate times and encouragements. So we understand that when you get to the New Testament, they're known as the Gospels. And, one of the coolest and awesome explanations I've ever heard about it is that you had four gentlemen, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and they were four of the 12 disciples that Jesus had during his ministry on earth. And ultimately, what Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John did is, unlike the Old Testament, okay, the Old Testament is sequential. So each book of the Bible was written during the same period of time from beginning to end. From Genesis all the way to Malachi, everything was, Genesis started the beginning, then Exodus was when the Jews left Egypt, the exiting out, and so on and so forth. And everything stacks up on top of each other. It's sequential. But Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are not sequential books of the Bible. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are parallel books of the Bible. All four of the books of the Bible talk about the life of Jesus from four different people's perspectives. And so when you understand the Gospels, that's the point where they can talk to you about how you can understand the life of Jesus and what he did from different perspectives. Because each one of the men, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John, they all came from a different background. They had a different job and vocation before they became disciples. And so when they wrote their books, there was different things that were important to them, different, perspectives of how they wrote the stories, what was important for them to write down. And so that's where it's great when you really want to get deep dive into the life of Jesus, into what he came to do and accomplish. That's when reading these four Gospels and, understanding they're not sequential, that they're parallel. They were different events at different times, all throughout the same period of Jesus's life. And so immediately, once we've told the story of, the birth of Jesus and him, preparing and doing his ministry on earth and, literally doing what he came to, we immediately jump into Acts, and we start with the new covenant. Because what you have to understand is that when Jesus in the Old Testament, when he sat down with Abraham and created a covenant with his people, that was it. There was no Gentiles. There was no, you know, there was no extra besides the covenant that he created. But as you fast forward generations, here in the New Testament, God creates the church because now under the new covenant, he wants to establish a covenant, a relationship with all people. That's where we have the separation of Jew and Gentile. That's where we have that understanding of the definition of, okay, these are the people that were under the first covenant that still exists, but now Jesus came to create a new covenant to save everyone. And that's where we get into the, people get into this misunderstanding of, well, that's why you don't have to worry about the Old Testament because, everything's new in how we relate and our relationship with Jesus now. Telling where they tore the veil in the temple, and how you can have personal relationship with Jesus instead of having a priest that does the offerings and the sin sacrifices for you because Jesus did it on the cross. But the point is that you understand that Jesus said, I came to fulfill the law, not to change it. So if you don't understand what he was fulfilling, if you don't understand what rules that he was making right, then you don't understand what he actually did for you. It's much more complex than just Jesus loves us. He came, died on the cross, raised from the dead so that we can be saved. It's so much deeper than that to understand what the law of the prophets was. When you go in the Old Testament and read through books like Judges and read to understand what the covenant, what the contracts, what the rules were, because it's bigger than just the Ten Commandments. To understand some of the laws that God had enacted, the book of Leviticus goes deep into it. The book of Leviticus was actually written for the Levite nation. That was one of the 12 tribes of Israel, where the Levites, those were the high priests. Those were the ones that God instructed what the main laws for, sacrifice and atonement of sin till Jesus came. They were the ones that wrote those laws out. It wasn't just the Ten Commandments. It was the day-to-day lifestyle, so to speak. What foods to eat, what foods not to eat, etc., etc. And so when you understand that, Jesus came to fulfill those laws so that we could live in relationship with him to understand it, that's where we still need to study that stuff. And so in the book of Acts, that's where, the second, if you will, the new covenant and the creation of what Jesus calls his bride, the church. That's Christians. That's all of us. And so when you understand that, that's where, Jesus tells us that we need to contend earnestly for the faith, that we need to understand and study to show ourselves so that we can live according to what he's called us to do. A lot of people will overlook Acts and not even read the book of Jude because they're like, well, But the fact of the matter is these indications are understanding of discipline of what that new covenant was based on. Establishing the grace of God, the need to remain faithful to the message of salvation and understanding. Jude, the book of Jude, it warns against ungodly people, false teachers, and people who ultimately deny, God altogether. In the book of Jude, he actually takes some of the old prophecies and, kind of rewords them to show the warnings that still apply to this day. And so that's why it's necessary for us to read the whole Bible, to read through these books where it says, hey, in the Old Testament, the prophet Jeremiah said this, or the prophet Ezekiel said this. Because if we don't understand where it came from, we're like, oh, I don't need it. It doesn't apply to me. But it applies to you even more than you realize. And so as we've walked through this and understand about, God establishing the new covenant, you've got to understand that, Jesus fulfilling the salvation, he went back to fix the broken sin at the beginning. So now that everything in the Old Testament points to Jesus and him fixing everything that went on in the Old Testament, we now have to fix it and put it all back together, put it back in reverse order. And that's where we get the new covenant, the new church, the new people of God, now that Jesus is able to fix it. But now we're going to go right back to what we had. What did we have before the old covenant? We had the one world government, or the Tower of Babel. So as you can see here, we immediately get into the next, in Revelation chapter 6, it talks about the Antichrist. And that's where it gets into the whole story of the figure emerging who will establish himself as the ruler of everything. And we get into, not only the number of the beast, but we get into, the whole idea of economic control, the persecution of saints, and the mark of the beast, and buying and selling. And, that's where we get the idea of one world government. Because the word government is basically an entity that governs everything. That every country right now has a government. But the Antichrist is somebody who's going to come in and try to join together the one world, the new world order. There's so many different phrases that different people have used, but, us getting into, the biggest eye-opening thing that's occurred recently about it even being possible for a one world government is honestly Bitcoin. Having a digital currency that literally is not tied to any specific country's merit of origin. In the United States, they have the dollar bill. In the European Union, all of those countries, they don't use the dollar. They trade the dollar. In Mexico, they have pesos. Each country, or each union of countries has its own, monetary, system. And so the reality is that Bitcoin, being completely digital, is a system of electronic funds that technically, when you look at it, it isn't tied to any country. It's completely anonymous and digital. And so when you look at the fact that we have a system in place now for the first time in history that allows countries to buy and sell and trade different things under a single monetary value. No longer are you going to have to, if you're coming from England and you've got, printed out money, where you're going to have to go when you come to America and go to a bank and get exchange rate for how many dollars you're going to get. We used to have the Swiss franc from Switzerland. They were called francs. You don't have to come from Mexico with pesos and get them changed into dollars. Bitcoin allows you to have a digital currency that you that currency can be used anywhere equally the same. And everybody looks at that and goes, man, that's awesome. That's great. Except that's what leads to having a governing body, a one world government that can control everything everywhere. And that's where we get into it. Now, the wonderful thing is that, the Antichrist does lead to Revelation 19, where Jesus will return and defeats the Antichrist. And so, that's the ultimate thing that leads to, the story of Revelation from 6 through 19. It goes through the seals and, the different churches. And there's, we can unpack that and get real deep into that. But the overall arcing point is that after the Antichrist is here and we have that established one world government, it's time for sin and Satan to exit. That's where God's going to come and judge. And that's where Jesus in the return. And that's where we see the wrath of God, where this time he will destroy with fire, not water. And that's ultimately where, destroying everything leads to chapter 20 of Revelation, where sin and Satan will exit. Because after the tribulation and the 1,000-year period, Satan is bound. That he will have the final battle and destruction, being cast into hell, into the lake of fire. And then ultimately we understand that the conclusion in the mirror of the whole beginning of creation is the last 2 chapters of Revelation, where we have a new heaven and a new earth, where God dwells among his people. Death, mourning, pain, sickness, sadness, they're no more, because we've all been redeemed. So when you look at the overarching theme of the Bible, it allows you to fully understand that, what started as righteous people can now become redeemed people. Because part 1 was Jesus dying for our sins to make us redeemed. But in between Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection, which leads to salvation, and his coming back, which leads to redeemed people, is now our time to try to bring people in and teach them about the story of the Bible, teach them about the love of God, teach them about the story of Jesus. And so if you look at this picture and understand the mirror images of the Bible, it will allow you to have a better understanding that whether you're reading anything in the New Testament, that there is a parallel to the same very story in the Old Testament. If you look at, 2 books that are talked about a lot in leadership of churches is the book of Timothy and the book of Titus. Because when Paul, the apostle, was beginning the church, because Jesus told him, upon this rock I will build my church. And when Paul the apostle started and was teaching Timothy, that's where the books of Timothy and Titus start laying out the leadership of the church and governance and so on and so forth. That's a bigger unpacked story for a different day. But its parallel is the book of Leviticus, where God is telling the Levites how to run the church and how to, how the laws and, how things are laid out. And so you start to understand that every book in the New Testament has its parallel in the Old Testament. It has its foundation of its origins, which means that it's a mirror image. So when God was establishing fundamentals and rules in the Old Testament, he didn't change them in the New Testament. He just added to them. Jesus did not change all the rules of interacting with God. Let me say that again. Jesus didn't change the rules of how we interacted with God. He simply changed how we could interact with God. And that's what you have to understand about the New Testament, is that everything that was will be restored again, and it's being done in a very methodical order. You know, the fact that the city of Jerusalem and the country of Israel, yes, they're in war right now, which should not be surprising to anyone. They were not even a country till the 1940s. So the Bible predicting that there would be wars and rumors of wars, and the Bible predicting that people would fight against the nation of Israel for thousands of years, hundreds of years, there was no nation of Israel. So nothing in the Bible could come true because there was no nation for them to fight against until 1940. And so things are happening now. There was no way for a one world government if we were all not speaking the same language and still not understanding. But now we have technology and apps like Babbel that can teach you to go anywhere in the world and learn to translate on the spot to talk to anybody from any life, from any culture, from any ethnicity in any language. And then things like Bitcoin that allow goods and services to be traded with any country around the world at any monetary value. Things are lining up in place so that this can truly actually come to pass. And so this is now the time not to be going, oh my God, I can't stand the way the world is now, and I need to tuck my tail and hide in a corner and just wait for Jesus to come back so I can go to heaven. No, if anything, this is the time for us to go, look, there is proof, there is undeniable proof that the Bible is real. This is happening. And this is the time for us to get ready for Jesus to come back. So I need to let as many people as I know, hey, are you not a Christian? Do you not know about the love of Jesus? Let's have a conversation. We're not trying to make churches bigger because it's a celebrity contest. I have gone to some of the smallest churches in North America, churches that have less than 50 members. And they'll be some of the most sincerest, heartfelt, loving people you'll ever meet. I've gone to churches that have 10, 15, 20,000 members, and there are people in there that are irritated, that are just not happy, they're cold shoulder, they don't show any love. You even wonder why they're at the church in the first place. We're supposed to be the bride of Christ, one body with many parts. I've done a couple of conversational pieces on this channel about different denominations and, what that can mean about, the word diversity, if you will, different ways to interpret it and so on and so forth. And I could do a deep dive. I've had conversations with fellow believers about different things like that and so on and so forth. But the reality is that at the fundamental core, the whole Bible, Old and New Testaments, points to Jesus. It's all about relationship with Him. That is the fundamental purpose of all of this. And so if we want to have conversations about denominations and differences and, the Reformation and Protestants and, this denomination versus this and Catholic versus Eastern Catholic, Orthodox, we can have conversations about it, but is that as important as making sure that no matter what church you're attending, that you're actually all about a relationship with Jesus and what it means to live for Him? Because relationship with Jesus is a two-part thing. It's not only living for Jesus, but it's also living with Jesus. I've said it several times on this channel. The Bible does say, depart from me because I did not know you in Matthew. And it doesn't say that because, you weren't doing the right things. It talks about relationship. It doesn't matter what you do in His name. If you're Catholic, it doesn't matter how much Mass you go to. It doesn't matter how many, walking through all of, how many prayers, how much, none of that is going to apply if you don't have a relationship. You know, if you go to a non-denominational church or Baptist church or whatnot, and you try to serve and you help in, you know, whether it's the worship team or, you know, an usher, a greeter, a host, or, you know, whatever you do with the church, if you're serving and helping out at the church, that's still not going to matter either if you don't have a relationship. I've said it before. You think about having a job at a company where the CEO, you know their name, you might have shook their hand once or twice, but you've never sat down and had lunch with them, or you've never, you know, had a meeting with them and learned about them as a person. You just know their name, but you work for the company, so that makes you an employee, but that doesn't make you, you know, an integral part of that company, not for its future. And that's the same with people going to church, that, you know, they call themselves Christians and they go through the motions, they do the activities, but that doesn't mean that they have a relationship. And that's the one thing that we have to really get our fundamental focus on. And so I hope this gives an overview to understand the Bible from a fresh perspective, of really understanding its mirror identity, and understanding that there are parallels. And, you know, anytime we're looking at something in the New Testament, we should be looking at the parallels in the Old Testament, looking what God had established and what God had to change in order to rebuild it, so that we can understand how it applies to us and how we can live. So I hope this was helpful. Please like and subscribe. Please share this with everybody you can. If you'd like to help support the channel, buy me a coffee, and the link is in the description, as well as the slide that was the thumbnail for this video, so you could keep that for reference if you want to come back and watch this video again and maybe write some of the things I've said down. It's really awesome. It's really helpful. And so I pray that this is helpful to everybody. And I'll see you next time.